Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. There are many, many versions of the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Some of these legends were written down more than 500 years ago, in about the year 1470, by Sir Thomas Malory. Put them into a book he called Morte D'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur. His words were not the actual legends, though, but his retelling of even more ancient stories. Many of the words he used aren't in our normal vocabularies anymore, so in order to tell the story in a way that we can all understand, I turned to a version that I first read many, many years ago. When my dad was a little boy, he had a book called King Arthur and His Knights. By the time I had a chance to read it, the cover had been worn off from many years of hard usage, but the words were still there, and I was caught up in the exciting tales of knights and ladies and their amazing and sometimes magical adventures. The version I'll be reading here is as close as I could find to that old version from my and my dad's childhood. But even though these stories are so old, I think you'll find them to be as fresh and exciting as they were when other generations of interested readers were enchanted by King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. In this first selection, we meet Merlin, the renowned magician, King Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father, and of course, young King Arthur himself. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. King Arthur and His Knights. The Two Dragons. Merlin, the most famous magician of legend, even in his youth, seemed to be unlike the ordinary boy, and a good many people said that he was half fairy, and were rather afraid of him. He never did wicked or cruel things, but he would often rock his sides with laughter, for what seemed to be no reason at all. Sometimes he would disappear for a week or two, and it was whispered of him that he would catch and ride the wild stags, and that, when he rode a great antlered beauty, all the pretty does and their young followed him, so that the forest glades seemed alive with flying herds of deer. The gossips said, too, that the fairy people were building a house for Merlin in the deep green places of the woods, a house with 70 windows and 60 doors, where, as soon as he was old enough, he would live quite alone. But when Merlin was stared at on account of these things, he only laughed to himself as usual, and, unconcerned, went about his business. Then one day a party of horsemen came riding along toward the palace in which Merlin had been born. They asked all whom they met where they might find a certain handsome youth, of whom many strange tales were told. The things they mentioned were exactly the stories that were about Merlin, so, of course, everybody who answered the horseman told them where Merlin could be found. And curiously enough, as the riders drew rein before the gate of the city, there stood the slender boy with his laughing mouth, and his eyes so clear and wild and free. One of the horsemen sprang down, seized Merlin, and flung him on his own saddle. Then he sprang up behind, set spurs to his steed, and galloped off in company with his friends. Merlin neither struggled nor cried out. He just laughed to himself as usual, for ever since he was a baby, he had known that this would happen to him. On went the party of horsemen at full speed until they came to a country far from Merlin's home. Between the mountain passes they rode, and presently came out upon a low plain, where hundreds of workmen were toiling and toiling and toiling to build a great tower. They had brought great piles of stone together, but these were lying about, broken or piled in muddled heaps. Men on horseback rode to and fro, calling out directions or rebuking the workmen for their carelessness. The poor workmen staggered about, placing the stones one on top of the other, but however careful they were, or in whatever position they put them, the stones were no sooner set up than they, one and all, fell down again. Watching the work from a grassy mound stood a tall man in armor, with a crown on his head and a cruel yet frightened face under the crown. Behind him waited a standard-bearer in royal purple, and over his crowned head hung the flag that had floated over many a prince of a long, long line of kings. The company of horsemen galloped up to the mound. Taking Merlin down from the horse, they led him, bound, up to the cruel-eyed monarch who stood there. "Is this the boy?" asked the king. "You have found the child who was described to me?" "Yes, sire," answered the rider who had first seized Merlin. "We have found him and brought him to you." The king looked steadily and fiercely at Merlin, who smiled back pleasantly, not at all afraid. "You laugh, child," said the king with a heavy frown. "You do not know your fate. Do you see these stones in that place where the men have built the foundations of a great tower?" Merlin nodded. He looked around at the heaps of unused stones, so many of which were broken and spoiled. "In that tower," went on the king, "I mean to find a safe refuge from the terrible enemies who swarm on all sides of my country. These foes will assuredly ride one day over the mountains, and unless I provide a safe retreat, will conquer my kingdom and kill me. Only a strong tower can be my haven. But although I have tried for many months to build it, no sooner are the stones set up than they all fall down again." "I am not surprised at all to hear it," said Merlin, apparently little interested in what the king was saying. "Wait," growled the king, like angry thunder. "You will soon be less unconcerned. I was told by a magician that only the blood of a youth, of whom it was said he was half a fairy, could give firmness to the foundations of the tower. You, I understand, are that unhappy child. My tower I must have, though your blood be spilled in order to build it." Even this cruel king looked unhappy as well as alarmed as he spoke. But in spite of all his sorrow and his fear, he was quite determined to kill Merlin, so that he could go on building his tower. Merlin laughed, bowed, and sat down on the grass of the mound, right under the royal purple flag that was held by the royal standard-bearer. "Indeed," said he, "but even my blood, great king, will not help you to build a tower on the top of a lake of water." The king frowned with perplexity and stared at the boy who was said to be half a fairy. "Lake of water? What do you mean?" he demanded. "There is no lake here. Nothing but solid red-brown earth." "Set your workmen to dig around the foundations of your unfinished, tumbling-down tower, and you will soon see for yourself," laughed Merlin, rocking himself to and fro, with his hands clasped about his knees. The king, whose name was Vortigern, was so amazed that he actually did as the strange mocking boy told him. He sent for the architect who was trying in vain to build the tower, and bade him order the workmen to dig around about the foundations with their spades. So the workmen stopped trying to set up the stones, and began shoveling out soil instead. And behold, almost immediately they were digging in mud, and up bubbled the hidden water through the mud, and down fell the banks of the ditches, followed by all the stones that had not tumbled down before. And as the stones and banks slipped down, more and more water rushed up, until at last the whole of the middle of the plain was one great lake, from which the workmen were all running away in one direction, and the architect and the horsemen in another. But King Vortigern and Merlin sat together under the royal standard on the grassy summit of the mound, gazing earnestly at the enormous lake. Then the king turned to Merlin more afraid now of this strange laughing boy than of all the people whom he expected to come riding over the hills to kill him and seize his kingdom. What does it mean?" he asked, trembling. "What does it all mean?" Merlin shook his head. Suddenly tears sprang to his eyes and rolled down his cheeks. He was sorry for the cruel king, though Vortigern had never been sorry for him. "There is a great stone below the lake," he said in a whisper. "2 dragons sleep there, one red and one white. One day they will come out from under the stone and meet on the waters of the lake in a fearful battle. In the white dragon is the soul of your strongest enemy. In the red, you may see the reflection of yourself." Then Merlin stepped down from the mound and went slowly away, and nobody tried to hold him. But Vortigern sat on the grass and stared for a week on end at the still green waters of the magical lake. And at last, while he stared, he saw the waters shudder and break into great waves. The waves sprang higher and higher and broke into foamy strands, looking like the white and shaggy manes of horses tossed by the wind. Then up through the hills and the valleys of the storm-lashed water came the white dragon and the red dragon. The white dragon was as pale as snow, and the red dragon was as scarlet as blood. Their wings, high above the angry waves, looked like crimson and silver clouds flying low across the sky. And from end to end of the fairy lake they fought each other, until, with a great cry, the red dragon fell dead upon the beach among the green rushes and the broken stems of the water flowers. Vortigern rose and fled, but he thought he heard the voice of the fairy boy echoing all around about him as he went. "In the white dragon is the soul of your strongest enemy. In the red dragon, you may see the reflection of yourself." The king arrived at his palace quaking with fear, but lo, his courtiers came running to tell him that the lake had sunk back deep into the earth, and that now the workmen were building his tower as fast as ever they could. So Vortigern began his old, cruel, wicked ways once more. Then, as soon as the tower was finished, he shut himself up in it for safety. But at night, very often, he woke up panting with terror, for in his dreams he had seen again the mighty battle between the white dragon and the red dragon. And as he had feared, one day his strongest enemy came over the hills with a great army. For Vortigern's people, racked with their king's wickedness and cruelty, had sent out a pitiful cry for help. The king who rode over the hills was great and good, and he rescued the unhappy people, and then went on to the big tower and bade Vortigern come out. There was no answer from inside, and so the soldiers set fire to the tower, and it blazed fiercely for days and days, until at last the walls were all burned away. Nothing was left but a heap of ruins, lying on the very spot where the red dragon had fallen dead after the great fight with the white dragon on the lake. Vortigern had been shut up in the tower all this time, so that it happened that he was killed by the great king, just as the red dragon had been killed by the white. But nobody could be sorry, for he had been cruel to everyone, and would have willingly slain Merlin to save his own wicked life. So the good king reigned over the kingdom in his place, and was called Uther Pendragon. The reasons for this name and some of the things that Uther did, you will hear about in another story. The Holy Grail. Long before Merlin was born, there lived in an eastern country a good and holy man called Joseph, who had for many years been the guardian of a wonderful cup. Nobody quite knew whence his cup had first come, nor who had made it, nor what gave it the lovely radiance which always surrounded it, and made it look more beautiful than any fairy goblet, set with emeralds and pearls. But all Joseph's friends knew that the cup was a great treasure, and that only a good and faithful man could have been chosen as its guardian. So they honored and respected Joseph, and talked reverently of the precious chalice of which he had the care. This cup was called the Grail cup, and sometimes Joseph would summon his children and his grandchildren, for he was quite an old man, and the best loved of his friends to take their seats at a silver table which he himself had made, in the middle of which he would set the Grail cup. Then, while everyone looked at the shining mist in which the cup was half hidden, Joseph would tell another good man called Allen, whom he loved very dearly, to go to a certain stream and catch a silver fish that he would see swimming about in the clear water. Allen would go willingly, and however often he went, he always saw the silver fish gleaming and flashing among the singing bubbles of the stream. He would catch the fish and bring it to the bright table to show it to Joseph, who would then tell him to take it and broil it on a fire of clear embers. When this was done, Allen served the fish to the people who sat about the silver table. No matter how many there were to feed, there was always enough, and when the feast was over, all who had shared in it felt revived, content and joyful, strong to do what was right, and to resist what was wrong. They would go away glad and grateful, wondering how it was that Allen could always catch so magical and marvelous a fish. They never really understood the secret, which belonged to Allen and Joseph alone, but they gave Allen the name of the rich fisher, and as the rich fisher, he has been known for many hundreds of years. So it happened that month after month, the silver table was spread, the Grail cup was displayed, and the mysterious fish was served by the rich fisher. But wicked men ruled the country in which Joseph lived, and they had already once thrown him into prison because he would not give up his cup. They were again plotting against him when, one day, as he worked in his garden, he was visited by a beautiful spirit who told him that he must take the Grail to a distant country called West over the Sea. Joseph asked how this could be done. "For," he said, "I am only a gardener and a worker in the cornfields, and I have no ship in which to voyage, nor sailor friends to manage its oars and sails." The bright spirit, however, bade him have faith and not be afraid. He was trustfully to set off with his children and his friends, and they were to carry the silver table and the shining cup with them. Then the vision faded away among the vines and the dark cedar trees, and Joseph went into his house, and, sending for the rich fisher, told him and everybody else to make ready for the journey. Well, they set off as soon as they could, Joseph, the rich fisher, their children and their friends. With tender care they carried the silver table, and Joseph bore the shining cup in a casket set with hundreds of precious stones. After traveling for many days, they reached the seashore. There lay the deep blue ocean ahead of them, rosy purple in the far distance, and overhung with the clouds of sunset that, delicate and golden, looked like enchanted islands. One of these, everybody felt quite sure, must be the home chosen for the Grail cup. But between them and the enchanted islands of the sunset, the sea rolled its long, murmuring, restless waves. Not a sail was to be seen, not a single little boat rocked in the green furrows near the shore. Joseph stood at the edge of the water, perplexed and wondering, and the sunset light fell on his white underrobe and scarlet mantle. As he stood with everybody silently watching him, a voice suddenly floated across the shore. "Take off your white underrobe, Joseph," said the voice, "and spread it upon the sea." Joseph bowed his head, and while his people gazed in wonder, he took off his white underrobe, and stepping into the ripples, spread the soft, finely sewn linen out upon the water. It floated like a beautiful raft, spreading wider and wider on the waves, and Joseph heard the voice a second time, falling as musically as the song of a bird through the quiet evening air. "Step forward, and take your stand upon it, and let all your people follow you." Joseph moved forward, and lifting high the casket which held the Grail cup, stepped upon this strange white boat. The linen garment was firm to his feet, and rocked up and down like a strong ship at anchor. He stood there fearless and upright, and called to all his people to join him. In twos and threes they came, amazed but trustful, bringing with them the silver table, while Joseph still held up the casket in which the shining cup was safely hidden. Room was found for everyone upon the floating white robe, and the silver table was set in the very middle. Then, as soon as his people had gathered around Joseph, some strange power stirred the quiet ripples of the sea. The linen robe began to move from the shore, and in a very few minutes, the keeper of the Grail cup, Alan, the rich fisher, and all their children and grandchildren found themselves traveling swiftly and smoothly across the ocean in the direction of west over the sea. The sun sank, the moon rose, and still the white linen robe, with all these people clustered together upon it, sailed faster than any ship over the starlit water. Then, by and by, the moon set too, and the sun climbed again into the sky behind the travelers. As it rose, it threw its golden beams upon the fresh and fragrant, still drowsy world, and Joseph cried out joyfully that he could see the sandy beaches, the high cliffs, and the distant mountains of west over the sea. And there, like a costly gem in a setting of polished silver, lay the land, sparkling and beautiful. But as the travelers drew nearer, they saw that while they had left warmth and flowers and fruiting trees behind them, they had come to a country where winter reigned. This land was cold and snow-covered. The rocks glittered with the frosts of the night. The streams were hushed under the silence of the ice. The outspread robe floated into a little bay, and the chill winds of the north blew upon the travelers' faces as one by one they stepped down into the icy ripples and hurried breathlessly to the shore. Joseph came last of all, and as he left his strange ship, the voice came again down from the mountains, telling him to lift his robe and put it once more upon his shoulders. He did so, and behold, it was quite warm and dry. Then he and the rich fisher led all the people up a narrow pathway, which climbed the cliffside, and still Joseph bore the Grail, while some of the others willingly carried the silver table between them. They reached the top of the cliff, and then they traveled onward, over rugged mountains and through peaceful valleys, until they reached a place called Glastonbury. And Joseph knew that here he was meant to build a little church of wood. He leaned on his staff for a long time, looking about him with joy in his eyes. It seemed to him a wonderful thing that he was to build a church in the island of Britain, which was the real name of west over the sea. Then, as he leaned on his staff, he felt it move and tremble strangely under his hand. He glanced down, and lo, he saw little twigs and stems, laden with green leaves and pale white flowers, sprouting out on all sides of the staff. Taking his hand from it, startled, he perceived that it had rooted in the frost-bound earth. Wonderingly, he touched the tiny flowers, and even as he touched them, snow began to fall and mingle its feathery flakes with the pearly petals. Then the staff shot upward, and great boughs, fully clothed with blossoms, branched about Joseph's figure and high above his head. In a few minutes he was standing amazed under a spreading thorn tree, laden with sweet-smelling snow-white bloom. Then Joseph called the rich fisher to him. He called, too, to all his followers, who stood as amazed as himself, and told them to set down the silver table under the flowering tree. They did so, and the rich fisher, in obedience to Joseph, went to a little half-frozen stream close at hand. There, swimming about close to the edge of the ice, he saw the beautiful gleaming fish. Quickly he caught it, and making a fire of sticks, roasted it upon the clear embers. Then, coming back to the silver table, he saw that Joseph had set the shining cup in the center of it, and that everyone was prepared to share in the magical feast. So there, under the blossoming thorn tree, the children and followers of Joseph and the rich fisher ate their first banquet at Westover-the-Sea. While the snow fell thickly all about them and covered the fields and plain of Glastonbury with a mantle of purity. Now, while they were feasting, an old man dressed in a long robe, who was called a druid, passed by and paused, utterly amazed at what he saw. Well might he be surprised to see these Eastern people, in their blue and purple and scarlet robes, seated around a silver table under a tree covered with flowers. He, with a strange feeling of awe, gazed at them, and at a beautiful cup, which was set in the middle of the table, and which shone as delicately as a little moonlit cloud. Even while he watched, the banquet came to an end. The strangers stood up. The one who seemed to be the chief took the cup into his hands. Others lifted the silver table, and, unaware that they were seen by the old druid, they all swept away in a radiant procession toward the inland forests, leaving the blossoming tree standing, mysterious and beautiful, under the falling snow. The druid stepped up to the tree, touched it, and smelled the flowers. Then he went back to the grove of oaks in which he lived, and wrote down all that he had seen in a parchment book, fastened with gold clasps. This book he locked up, and it was kept hidden for many years, but Merlin heard of it, and one day long, long afterward, he came to Glastonbury, found it, and read it. What he did after he had read the book, you will be told in another story. But meanwhile, Joseph and the rich fisher and their friends sought the king of the country, and he gave them for their own the piece of land where the thorn tree was blossoming. So they built a little wooden church there, and the country people worshipped in it for many years. The Dragon in the Sky. One dark night, while a storm was raging, Merlin stood at one of his 70 windows and looked and looked and looked up at the wild sky. He was expecting to see something there, something very unusual and wonderful, which one of his fairy books had told him to expect. For a long time, however, nothing happened. The watching magician saw only the clouds racing like inky shadows over the clear high spaces that were sprinkled with stars. Then suddenly he caught sight of a little pearly glimmer in the north. This little pearly glimmer grew brighter and brighter. It turned from silver to gold, and from gold to deep shining red, like the red of rubies. Merlin gazed still more eagerly, and presently in the heart of the red glow he saw a great star brighten, as you might see a crimson spark suddenly break into a shining flame. From the great star, one ray shot out suddenly, brilliant as a diamond, and slender as a knight's spear. At the end of the ray appeared a globe of fire, which, as Merlin still watched, uncoiled itself slowly, and took the shape of a beautiful but terrifying dragon. This fiery dragon opened its mouth and sent out 2 more rays, one to the east, the other to the west. The eastern ray seemed to have no end, but spread out into a great glow, so that you might almost have thought the sun was just about to rise. The ray to the west led into the night shadows, and then broke up into 7 smaller rays, which spread themselves in a golden fan above the shadowy peaks of the distant hills. When Merlin had seen all this happen, he laughed gladly, and flying down the long staircase of his fairy home, as lightly as a bird or a butterfly, he set off on invisible wings through the night. Always the fiery dragon shone in the sky overhead, and Merlin knew that its bright form was hanging just over the castle of Uther, the king. As the wizard drew near to the castle, he dropped to his feet on the grass and took on the form of an old man wrapped in a cloak, with his white beard blowing about him in the wind, and the hood of the cloak drawn down over his eyes and forehead. Merlin walked up to the great castle gates and knocked loudly with his staff. Now all this time the great flaming dragon was lying stretched out in the sky, bathing the towers and the turrets of the castle in a crimson light, fiery and frightful. The guards and servants, the porters and cooks and the pages had seen it, and were very, very, very much frightened. Nobody dared to answer the door at first, so Merlin knocked again much more loudly. Then, when a terrified porter appeared, the magician, in a voice of authority, demanded to be taken to the presence of the king. There was something in Merlin's voice that the porter dared not disobey. He hurriedly opened the great gate and let the old man in. Then he led Merlin through the courtyard, all aglow with the dragon's light, down the great stone corridor, across the hall hung with gorgeous tapestry, where trembling pages waited, dressed in satins and silks. There the porter paused and pointed, and Merlin went on alone, right into the royal apartment of the king. King Uther sat on his throne, pale and grave and quite alone. Through a great window, curtainless and arched, came the fiery glow from the dragon in the sky. It stained the fresh green rushes on the floor with crimson, and shone all about the solitary figure of the king. Uther looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw an old man coming slowly up the room, wrapped in a long cloak, with a snow-white beard that streamed in long, thick strands far below his waist. "Who are you? Why do you come here unbidden and unannounced?" demanded the king sternly. But before he finished speaking, the old man threw back his cloak, and Uther saw who he was. "Merlin! My friend Merlin!" he cried in an altered voice. "I am indeed glad you have come. What means this blazing and terrifying dragon in the sky? Is it a sign of some cruel disaster, some great trouble that is about to fall upon my house?" Then Merlin answered. His voice sounded so joyous and triumphant that King Uther knew that the news was good, even before the magician spoke. "The dragon is the most wonderful sign that has ever shone in the sky above the castle of a king," cried Merlin. "I have been watching for it night after night, hoping and longing to see it come. It means that to you, and to the beautiful lady you love, a little prince will be born. This little prince will be the greatest king the world ever saw. He will reign over many subjects, and will conquer all his enemies. He is the ray that goes from the mouth of the dragon to the east. He will be as bright and beautiful as the rising sun. The ray that goes to the west and breaks up into 7 rays is your daughter. She will be not only a princess but a fairy, and have 7 fairy children, who will teach the men-children of the west the songs that fairies sing. See how the 7 rays end in a shining mist? That is the meaning of the fiery dragon, King Uther. the meaning I have hurried into your presence to explain." Uther listened breathlessly, while the light from the dragon shone crimson upon the faces and hands and robes of the old wizard and the young king. Then Uther leaned forward and pressed his fingers on Merlin's arm. "My beautiful lady," he said eagerly, "do you mean Aegearn?" He could hardly wait for Merlin's reply, because he had loved Aegearn for many months, but she was shut up in a castle, quite out of his reach. "Yes, I mean Aegearn," answered Merlin. "I promise that you shall have her for your bride. I promise, too, that you and she shall have this bright and beautiful prince, and this fairy-like princess for your children. But if you are to marry Aegearn through my help, you must make me a promise in return." "What is that?" asked Uther. "Tell me. There is no promise that I would not make for the sake of beautiful Aegearn." "You must promise that as soon as your little son is born, you will give him into my care. He has a great work to do in the world, and can learn to do it only if I have the care of him. Give me your promise, Uther, and I will set about the performance of mine." Then King Uther for a moment felt uncertain and sad. Where would be the gladness in a little princely son if the child was to be taken away from him as soon as he was born? But he loved Aegearn so passionately that after hesitating for only 1 second, he consented. "Very well, Merlin," he cried, "very well. You shall have my little son to bring up as your own child, if you will only make it possible for me to marry my beautiful Lady Aegearn." The red light shining through the window that fell from the fiery dragon in the sky grew stronger and fiercer as Uther spoke. When he had given the promise, the light blazed crimson and awful about the throne on which he sat, and glistened upon all the diamonds and sapphires in his scepter and crown. A peal of thunder rolled above the palace. A flash of lightning darted about the gray stone towers. The blazing dragon seemed to close its jaws. As it closed them, the rays drew slowly back into its great mouth, the 1 ray from the east, and the 7 rays from the west. It stretched out its long fiery claws, and 2 great golden wings rose, waving over its great golden head. Then for an instant it spread out these wings, and hung poised above the castle, so that all the pages and cooks and scullions and porters hid themselves in the darkest corners and cupboards and cellars they could find. But instead of swooping down upon the castle as they had expected, the blazing dragon struck its wings together once, twice, thrice. Once, twice, thrice the thunder pealed out again, and before its echoes had died away, the fiery creature had shot, swift as an arrow, far through the night sky, leaving behind it a long tail of starry light, like the tail of a comet. Even King Uther had crouched for a moment and covered his face. When he took his jeweled satin cloak from his eyes, the royal throne room was empty, dark and still. Merlin had vanished with the dragon, and had gone back to the fairy house of 70 windows and 60 doors. The king was left alone with the promise of a beautiful bride and a wonderful little son. The king stepped down from his throne and went to the window. He looked up to the sky and saw it dark and clear, silvered over with little quiet stars. Then he summoned a herald, who came, still trembling, and told him to take his trumpet and go through the castle, crying aloud these words: "King Uther has been told the meaning of the blazing dragon in the sky. It is a sign of great gladness and victory and well-being for himself and for his kingdom. From now the king will be known as King Uther Pendragon, and he lays command on his royal sculptors that 2 golden dragons immediately be made. One of these dragons will be set up in the capital of his kingdom. The other will be carried by his royal standard-bearer into every battle. These are the orders of Uther Pendragon, king of the lordly and ancient country of Britain." The Sword of the King. In due time, Merlin kept his promise to King Uther. It so happened that Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall, who had kept Ygerne shut up in his castle, was overthrown and slain in battle, and Uther became owner of the castle. All that Merlin had promised now came true, and Uther hastened to visit his beloved winsome Ygerne, and to tell her that he loved her and would always protect her. So she married him and became his queen. After the marriage, King Uther Pendragon and his sweet and lovely Lady Ygerne lived very happily in Tintagel Castle by the Cornish sea. You may see the ruins of it now, but you can never imagine, perhaps, how fine and strong it was in those days, hundreds of years ago. Massive grey towers rose above great grey roofs, and archers practiced shooting from the strong high walls. Sometimes the big gates and doors were closed. Sometimes they opened wide to let out large companies of soldiers, dressed in bright armor and riding on handsome spirited horses with gay bridles and reins. In the evenings, sounds of music and laughter came from inside. Minstrels with harps played and sang to the king and queen, and funny dwarfs in caps and bells made jokes or danced absurd little dances among the rushes on the floor. Oh, it was a wonderful place, was Tintagel, and you will never see anything like it nowadays. Folks were brave and cheerful then, and though they no doubt had terrific battles with their neighbors, they were so brave and courageous between times that their lives passed as happily as possible, what with work and play, banquets and tournaments. The knights loved and fought for the fair ladies. The fair ladies loved and looked after the knights. And bravest, most loving and fairest of all were King Uther Pendragon and Ygerne, the queen. And by their little son was born. Poor Ygerne was now told that Uther had promised to give the baby instantly into Merlin's charge. She was very sad about this, but she would not ask the king to break his word. Besides, she and Uther had often talked of the great future which Merlin had foretold for their child. So the king and queen kissed the baby prince, and the queen herself wrapped him up in a beautiful cloak of cloth of gold, and gave him into the charge of 2 ladies and 2 knights. Then Uther told the 2 ladies and the 2 knights to carry the tiny prince to a certain little half-hidden door in the castle wall, to open this door softly and silently, and to give the child into the arms of someone who would be waiting just outside to receive it. Singing little soft lullabies, the 2 ladies stepped carefully down the corridor, followed by the 2 knights. They reached the winding stairs and went down, down, down to the little half-hidden door. On a golden cushion, one lady carried the sleeping baby in its golden cloak. The other carried a tall candle, and the 2 knights, walking behind, carried 2 more candles, taller still, which cast strange wavering shadows on the grey walls. They opened the door, and the light of the candles shone out into the still dark night. From among the shadows came a dim, tall figure, not unlike a shadow itself. This figure held out its arms for the baby, and the ladies and the knights, without a word, gave the tiny boy into the mysterious stranger's arms. And thus was Arthur, all as soon as born, delivered at a secret postern gate to Merlin, to be holden far apart until his hour should come. Then they went back through the door with their candles and the empty golden cushion, and as they climbed up the winding staircase, they heard slowly dying in the distance the sound of the footsteps of a trotting horse. On the horse rode Merlin with the baby. Over hill and dale he went until he reached a quiet small castle in a valley. Here lived a good and sober knight called Sir Hector, who well knew why Merlin had come. Long ago the magician and King Uther had sent for Sir Hector, and asked him if he would receive a little child into his house, a little child who was to become very great and famous, but who must be brought up simply as a noble knight's son. Sir Hector had consented, and had been given lands and riches in return. So, when Merlin rode up in the dark night, Sir Hector and his wife met the magician gladly, and took the baby straight to their own nursery. Then Merlin had the little prince christened Arthur, and Sir Hector brought him up in his good, peaceful, and happy home. But Merlin was always at hand, watching over the boy. His father, King Uther, was content to leave little Arthur in the great wizard's charge. However, when he was dying, he sent for Merlin, and asked for news of the child. How happy he was when he heard that Prince Arthur was growing up into a beautiful little boy, already asking to ride his horse, hunt his hounds, and shoot his arrows with the other. How much better it was that he should, later, be brought up just as a good knight, instead of a king's favored son. Uther listened happily, certain now that his sacrifice of his baby had not been made in vain. Then he gave back to Merlin the round table, which, as you shall hear, had been placed in his care, and told him how it might be kept safe and sound until Arthur came into his kingdom. Accordingly, Merlin had it carried far away to Camelard, where it was placed in the care of an old friend of Uther's, another great king whose name was Leodogran, who in his turn gave it into the charge of 250 knights, all of them brave, noble, and good. What happened to it afterward, you will hear in another story. So Uther died, but nobody knew that the little lad in Sir Hector's house was the dead king's son and heir. The barons of the country began to quarrel tooth and nail among themselves. Each of them wanted the power to rule over the rest. Never was there such an uncomfortable commotion. Wherever you met, you would meet soldiers on horseback, shaking their spears and shouting out fine speeches about their own baron, and angry speeches about the barons of other people. The woods and the meadows rang with the sound of steel and the thunder of horses' feet, so that at last Merlin went to the archbishop, who mourned over these things very sorrowfully in his lonely palace of peace, and told him to call the warring barons to London for Christmas, that they might go to service in the church and forget their quarrels, if it were only for the short and gentle hours of Christmas Day. The barons dared not disobey the archbishop, so to London and to church they duly went. After the service, out streamed the congregation into the churchyard, and there they saw something that had assuredly not been visible when they went in. At the extreme east end of the churchyard, lit by the pale Christmas sun, stood a stone as white as marble, but 1,000 times more beautiful. In the center of it was a square of steel like an anvil, and from the steel rose the glittering handle of a strong, sharp sword. In letters of gold about the sword were written strange and thrilling words which said that whoever could draw the sword out of the stone was King of Britain, Uther Pendragon's only rightful heir. The barons crowded around the stone, wide-eyed and amazed. Each called out that he, if given a chance, was certainly the one and only chieftain who could draw the sword from the stone. Smiling oddly, Merlin, who stood nearby, bade them all try. Jostling one another in their hurry, they sprang one by one to the side of the stone, seized the handle of the sword, and pulled and tugged with all their might. But their efforts met with no success. The sword did not even tremble in its square of steel, while the gleaming golden letters written around it seemed to mock the barons with their quiet, sure message. At last the barons, tired and angry, went away from the churchyard and began to amuse themselves by holding a tournament in some meadows not very far away. After all, it was Christmas time, the season for junketings, jousts, and knightly games. And riding to the tournament, as a matter of course, came Sir Hector and his son Sir Kay, and the fair and noble boy Arthur, whom Sir Hector loved as much as his own child. As they passed the churchyard, they saw the sword, shining always in the stone that was like beautiful white marble, and they spoke to each other of the strangeness of the sight. Then they trotted forward, each on a handsome horse. But just as they were about to ride into the meadow, so bright with banners and gay voices, Sir Kay exclaimed in utter dismay that he could take no share in the delights of the tournament, for he had left his own sword at home. "Turn your horse quickly, my son," said Sir Hector to young Arthur. "Gallop home and bring your brother's sword. You are too young for the knightly games, but he must on no account be left out of them." Arthur did not wait to be told a second time. Home he went at full speed to fetch his elder brother's sword. But when he reached the house, everything was lonely and locked up. Sir Hector's lady had gone to the tournament herself, and had taken all the servants with her. For a minute or two Arthur hesitated. Then he was struck by the very happiest thought. "Ah, I will go to the churchyard," said he, "and take the sword that is sticking out of that big white stone. It will do just as well for my brother as his own." So he mounted his horse again, and off to the churchyard he rode. Dismounting, he hastened to the great stone. There, not even pausing to read the words which were written in the golden letters, he took the sword by the handle and pulled. Lo and behold, the sword came as easily and lightly from the steel in the middle of the marble as a rose is plucked from the delicate green shelter of its bush. Sword in hand, Arthur once more sprang into the saddle and galloped away to the tournament. Over the meadow grass he trotted, and straight into the hands of Sir Kay he gave the sword. Then, like the light-hearted, modest boy he was, he fell back among the other younglings, watching to see his elder brother's triumph with an eager and delighted expectancy. But Sir Kay was staring with all his eyes at the sword. He turned it this way and that, then rode off to where his father also watched from a distance. "Sir," he said to Sir Hector, "this sword, which young Arthur has brought me, is the very sword that no baron could draw from the stone in the east of the churchyard. You have heard what was written around it in letters of gold?" "I have heard," said Sir Hector, grave and startled, for he too had been told the story of the sword, set so firmly in the beautiful white stone. He too recognized the fair blade as it glittered in his son's hand. "If this is so, sir," cried Sir Kay with a glowing face, "then I must be King of Britain, Uther Pendragon's heir." But Sir Hector, deep in thought, had turned his horse's head. "Call your brother Arthur," he said, "and both of you follow me." In silence he rode to the churchyard, and in silence Kay and Arthur followed him. When they had all dismounted near the stone, Sir Hector looked at Arthur, who stood quietly by. "Put the sword back again," said he, and Arthur did so. Sir Hector turned then to Sir Kay. "Draw it out," he commanded. But Sir Kay, when he put his hand to the sword, could no more do this than any of the barons who had tried so hard. Then Sir Hector himself tried, and also failed. Tenderly he laid his hand on Arthur's shoulder. "It is your turn now. Show your brother, the truth." So Arthur, still quite simply and naturally, reached out his young quick fingers and taking the sword for the second time from the shining white stone, would have given it into Sir Hector's hand. But Sir Hector, instead of taking the sword, bent on one knee and did Arthur homage, as all good knights do homage to their liege lord and king. "My son," said he, "and that I cannot help calling you, though you are not my son. The writing in the golden letters was set down on the marble slab for you. Hail, Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon, and King of Britain! Receive before all others the loyalty of those who love you best, Sir Hector, whom you have called father, and his son, your brother, Sir Kay." This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to stories of King Arthur and his knights. If you enjoy this podcast, please send an email to kluker@marshallpl.org to tell me of your favorite stories. I'll talk to you again soon.